Okay, a program by Karl Rhodes on Henry and Susanna Heatwole Brunk. About to start here.
I'm delighted to introduce Karl Rhodes, who is the author of Heatwole, and also Kim, who is in the back table selling copies of this book, worth every penny of the $3 that it takes to buy. Oh, it's more than $3. Okay, $50. I think it's funny. I met Karl only today. It seems odd because we've been corresponding for really quite a long time. Somehow we got in touch and he told me about his project, told me about his book, which I ordered immediately. So Karl is the author of Heatwole, and he's getting ready to tell the rest of the story. What happens after the Brunks get to Kansas and meet the Coopriders. There are lots and lots of stories there. I have often said, this is the most interesting family story I have ever heard or read. So, Karl, we're delighted you're here. Let me introduce you. He is a great grandson of Peggy Rhodes. He retired from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, where he was a senior managing editor in the research department. No wonder you're good at research. Previously, he was director of external communications for Media General and executive editor of Virginia Business Magazine. His wife, Kim, lived in Richmond, Virginia. And today, I was able to introduce him to Kansas dust. And we went to Brunk Cemetery, then to Kaplan Cemetery, and eventually back home. Karl, we're delighted you are here.
System or not? Yeah. Now I am. Okay. I can't tell the difference when I hear it. I think we need to click on from the beginning on our slides. From the beginning. There we go. And now this will control it, correct? Okay. So this is indeed my great-great-grandmother, Peggy Rhodes. If you're looking for in a history book, it's Margaret Rhodes. And we'll talk about some of our sources on some of this information in a little bit. But Margaret is the name you're going to be looking for. But most people at the time of the Civil War would have called her Peggy because her mother's name is Margaret and her grandmother, one of the grandmothers' name is also Margaret. So Peggy Rhodes. Peggy, this is not an actual picture of her. This is a model. Pretending to be Peggy, but we did choose a model that looked a lot like pictures of Peggy's daughter when she was that age. So when Peggy's daughter was in her 30s, she looked a lot like this. And the bonnet is authentic, but it's not Peggy's bonnet. I'm not pushing anything up here.
There's music playing in the background because there's still another tab open. We've got to get to that tab, shut off the music, and then switch back on.
Oh, can we hear the music in the meantime?
We'll see if he can find it here for us.
Well, wait, how many lectures have you done in the last year?
It's been 2 years, really, since the book came out. I have done about 30 or 40. Most of them have been in Virginia, some in Pennsylvania, and one in Atlanta. This is our first trip west of the Mississippi, and our first trip to Kansas. Am I forgetting any? We do a fair number of Richmonds, which is where Kim and I live.
So people are interested in this story, obviously.
Absolutely, and it's almost always we have a technical problem. When we first start out, we always have some sort of technical problem. So
I'm glad we could fit what happens.
this is kind of business as usual.
Okay, there we go.
All right, I'm going to back it up using this. Is that okay? Okay. So for tonight's presentation, I want to really talk about two stories, maybe three. The first one is going to be about Peggy. Peggy ran a depot on the Underground Railroad mostly for Mennonites and Brethren, they were called dumpers back then, that refused to fight in the Civil War. Now, not all Mennonites felt that way, not all Brethren did, but the vast majority in Virginia refused to fight in the war. And Peggy would hide these young men in a secret cellar underneath her bedroom floor. Her husband, Henry, is dying of tuberculosis. Back then they would have said consumption. And so he's not able to help very much. The children, there are 5 children at the start of the war. The children are fairly young, so they're not able to help much either. The oldest is 10 years old. So that's our first story, the story of Peggy and the Underground Railroad. The second story will be about Henry Brunk, and thus the title, Invisible Brunk. Now this gives a little more emphasis to the connection here to Kansas, because Henry Brunk stayed at Peggy's depot on the Underground Railroad, her secret cellar, longer than anyone else. He was there almost a year. And then we'll finish out the story. He ends up in Kansas, of course. And then the third part of the story really is going to become my next book, is about Susanna, who marries Henry. So we're going to try to get 3 in 1 here, if we can keep it all working right. So Susanna, at the beginning of the war, Susanna and Henry had just gotten married. And the war comes along, and the Mennonites, of course, initially take a no-shoot pledge. Some of the young men do go off to war, but they pledge to the bishop and to themselves and to their families that we won't kill anyone, we won't hurt anyone. If we shoot, we won't take proper aim, or we won't shoot at all. And that's pretty much what happened. And this didn't work very well for anyone. And when they came back to put in the fall crops, they were allowed to go home and put in the winter wheat and so forth. The decision was made by the church that we need to start an underground railroad. And I don't think it's not a accident that they use that terminology. This is not an underground railroad for fugitive slaves, but they were aware of that underground railroad. And so they talked about underground railroad, depots, pilots, all the same guides, all the same terminology that was used in the other underground railroad. And of course, the Mennonites were opposed to taking up arms against their enemies. And this is one of the few quotes I'm going to include from the book itself, Peggy's War. I lifted it pretty much from the 1837 Mennonite Confession of Faith. And I recently had a Mennonite minister tell me, he said, that is the best description of non-resistance I've ever seen. So I want to tell you what a good job you did. And I said, well, I didn't do anything really. I just copied it out of the 1837 Mennonite Confession of Faith. And this is basically it there. So this is the reason why they have this underground railroad. And we know from Samuel Horst's book, any people here remember Samuel Horst? Yep, at least one. Died fairly recently at the age of 103. Samuel wrote a great book in the 1960s called Mennonites in the Confederacy, and he points out that this system was called the Underground Railroad. I think he was the first one to actually say that or notice that as a historian. So in Peggy's Depot, we have a quote here. This is an actual verbatim quote from Peggy's testimony about 80 people, and she would shelter 5 or 6 at a time, and then they would wait at Peggy's Depot until guides would become available to take these men through the mountains of what is now West Virginia into either Ohio or maybe back into Pennsylvania, where it was easier to stay out of the war. And just for fun, I wanted to show you where Peggy lived. This is, all of the green area you see in this picture is part of Peggy's farm, as it looks today. The dog's name is Piper. I always get that question. And the arrow, the yellow arrow, points to where Peggy's house used to be. The house is gone. That big red barn is sitting on, we think, an original foundation that goes all the way back to the Civil War. And then horizontally through the image here, you see a creek. And that is Cook's Creek, which plays an important role in the book. And also the hill in the background is Mole Hill. Does anyone from the valley or spent some time know what I mean by Mole Hill? Mole Hill is the remnant of a volcano. It's one of the few on the east coast of the United States that was created by a volcano. And they live kind of in the shadow of Mole Hill. The farm is actually much bigger than this. There's acreage behind the camera on our side, and also out to the left. It was 120 acres, and you got to remember, Peggy was taking care of a 120-acre farm without a husband to help her, and without much help from the children, while she's running this depot and hiding 5 or 6 men at a time under the house. And they did have a secret cellar. It wasn't just a matter of having a trap door that goes into a cellar. This was a trap door that goes into a cellar that there's no other way in or out. So these men would go through her bedroom floor to get in, and they had to come out the same way. And then she would put a rag rug on top of the trap door so that no one would see that there was any kind of door there. Now, on the left, Unionists and the Civil War experience in the Shenandoah Valley. I always like to mention this because this is where a lot of the information comes from. I used 100 sources, a little more than 100 sources to write Peggy's War, but this is the most important one. And it was written really in 6 volumes, starting in 2003 and finished in 2013. So it took 10 years to write this. And what it is a transcript of testimony before the Southern Claims Commission. And the Southern Claims Commission is a federal agency after the Civil War that was put together so that people who remained loyal to the Union could go to the government and say, I would like to get reimbursed for all of this livestock and crops and so forth that the Union Army took from me during the war. And Peggy filed such a claim, and this is why we have about 27 pages of actual testimony that really tells the story. And it's not just Peggy, it's also people like Henry Brunk and all the people that lived in the Shenandoah Valley that filed claims. So the Underground Railroad was in place by the spring of 1862. The war was already almost a year old. And the word came out from the governor of Virginia that all of the men that were on furlough to plant the crops had to go back. And the decision was made that if you willingly went back to the army, you would be excommunicated from the church and disqualified from future membership in the church if you weren't already a member. So that would be Henry Brunk. He was not yet a member. But the first test of that Underground Railroad happens on March 13th, which is the night before these men are supposed to report to the courthouse for their military duty. And they go through the mountains at night. They traveled at night. And after a couple of days, they were captured. This is a group of 70 plus men. About a third of them have horses. That illustration that you saw last is a little deceiving. They all had horses. They would have only had about 30 horses or so. But they were captured near Petersburg, and this is Petersburg, West Virginia now. Back then, Virginia and West Virginia was all the same. It was all Virginia. But they're captured near the town of Petersburg, and if you see that bridge there in the foreground, that is across the south branch of the Potomac River. And when they crossed the river there in 1862, there was no bridge. So they were having to ford a very fast-moving and high river. And when they did that, they attracted a lot of attention. People in the town were watching them and laughing at them and poking fun. And they did eventually get across the river, and they went through that town, and about a mile on the other side, they were confronted by initially just two Confederate Home Guard soldiers who said, we're going to arrest you, show us your arms. And of course, they didn't have very many guns. There was one pistol in that group that people fail to mention sometimes, but there was one pistol, but there were lots of little pocket testaments and maybe Mennonite confession of faith, and they were showing these pocket testaments and saying, this is the sword of the Spirit, this is our armaments. And they said, you can keep those. So they're captured and they're taken back to Richmond. I'm not going to tell you that whole story because I want you to buy the book. But they're taken to Richmond on a train eventually. They marched many miles, but then train to a place called Castle Thunder. And Castle Thunder was a prison where they held political prisoners. Not the military men themselves, not the soldiers that are captured, but political prisoners. So they were some of the first men to be put in Castle Thunder. And they were told that on the very next day, you're going to be executed. Now, Brunk is in this group, and so is Charles Rogers. I see one Rogers family member over here. Do we have other Rogers family members? Brunk, Henry Brunk, we got Brunk. Yeah, at least some of those. Yes, a lot of those. So Henry Brunk is in this group. We know that from Peggy's testimony before the Southern Claims Commission. And Gabriel Heatwole, one of Henry Brunk's best friends, is actually selected to be the first one to go down and be shot in front of the firing squad. Or at least that's what he thinks. And he goes down and they actually don't kill him. They make him march around and carry a gun. And that, in this case, was very painful for Gabriel Heatwole because he had a knife blade broken off in his hip. So they did that to taunt him, but they did not execute these men. And in fact, Virginia passed an exemption law. The General Assembly in Virginia did something that they haven't done since. They acted quickly. And they said, you know what, this makes no sense. We're going to have a law in Virginia that says if you pay a fine, if you pay a property tax, and if you are a member of a peace church, at the beginning of the war, you can be exempt from military duty. Problem with Henry Brunk was he was not yet a member of the church. Usually in Virginia at that time, Mennonites would join the church about the time they got married, but for some reason, Henry did not. And even though he was attended church faithfully, he was not technically a member of the church. So he was not eligible for this exemption act. So a lot of the prisoners go home. Brunk goes into the army. He goes to Stonewall Jackson's army in the Shenandoah Valley, which is convenient if you're going to desert. And they send him back, and in fact he does desert, and he goes to Peggy's Depot. We think he probably started at Peggy's Depot, this big circle, captured in Petersburg, taken to Richmond, and then ends up right back at Peggy's Depot. And this is Peggy's actual testimony about Brunk. So this is how we know that she hid Brunk. And she also mentions, I don't have it on the slide today, but Charles Rogers as well. And so they were there for a long time. Rogers was there for 6 weeks or so, and then he goes north with Magdalena Heatwole, which is Susanna's sister. Susanna and Magdalena, by the way, are Peggy's first cousins, so she knows them very well. So Charles Rogers goes north with a retreating army, and Henry stays behind because Henry's wife, Susanna Brunk, is having a difficult pregnancy. She is pregnant with Sarah, and it's not looking good. They already have one child, John Albert, and Sarah is coming along, but Susanna is very sick. So Henry doesn't want to leave. He continues to hide at Peggy's Depot. That's what she means by the condition of his wife and family. We put that with what Stella Erb tells us about what was going on, and we know that it was because she was pregnant with Sarah. And then, of course, Sarah comes out fine. The pregnancy is fine. Susanna eventually starts to feel better, but John Albert, the oldest child, becomes sick. We think he probably had diphtheria. There was a lot of cases of diphtheria during the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley for children that age. So it's a very, very good bet that he had diphtheria. And he dies fairly quickly. And of course we have the story. Some of the people here know this story already, but when John Albert dies, Henry has to go to the graveside service, either in disguise or he somehow manages to lay low. And the conscription scouts that are trying to put him in the army are there looking for him, but they do not find him. And that's one of the reasons I like to call him Invisible Brunk, because all of these cases come up where he's not spotted, he's not seen. And this one was a very emotional one. So that's John Albert's tombstone. If you're having trouble reading it, I did a little bit to help out there. The name John Albert is prevalent on both the Cooprider side of the family and on the Brunk side of the family. And I think I know why, at least on the Brunk side of the family. And this is another reason I like to call Henry Invisible Brunk. Some of you here have heard this story that John Albert Airy was sent by the colonel to go get Henry Brunk and bring him to the army. And he knows that John Albert Airy is the most likely man to find him because they were neighbors. They were neighbors and they were very good friends. And I think that Henry Brunk named his first son after John Albert Airy, the conscription scout that's now charged with going and finding him and bringing him to the army. Well, when I was researching Peggy's War, I could not find this man, John Airy. And the reason why is because Stella Erb, in her booklet, and George Brunk, and several other people spelled his name wrong. They spelled Airy wrong. Once the book came out and other people started talking to me about John Albert Airy, they gave me the proper spelling. I was able to search for it and come up with the actual person. We also then could go to old maps and see that, yes, they were next door neighbors. They were very good friends. And in the census, they were side by side in the census of 1860. So John Albert Airy confronts Brunk, or comes across Brunk in the middle of the road. He was probably going back and forth between his hiding place and Susanna's, where she's living. And he comes face to face with him in the road, And John Albert Airy says, do you know where I might find Henry G. Brunk? And of course, Henry Brunk is surprised by this because they know each other. They're very good friends. And Brunk, the story goes, replies, Mr. Petrie might know as well as anyone, knowing full well that Mr. Petrie does not know where he's hiding. But these are all neighbors. If you look at an old 1862 map, Petrie, Brunk, Airy, they're all side by side by side. So once again, and Brunk is invisible, at least Airy pretends that Brunk is invisible. So Henry goes back to his depot, his hiding place, and he decides that, well, I've been spotted, maybe I should move. So he does move to other depots, but we think that because he was at Peggy's depot for a year, almost a year, we think that that is where he wove these baskets. So he would weave baskets out of willow whip, and they would sell them for the price of the amount of wheat that the basket would hold. We have one of the baskets there at the back from Luann Zook. I was kind enough to bring that by, and we'll take a look at it after this. So R.J. Heatwole, it's time to bring him into the story. Let me back up just a second and say that Henry Brunk became Susanna Brunk's legal guardian at some point. I don't know if it's because she was too young to marry or why, but he becomes her legal guardian. She is now an orphan. Her parents have died. And Henry also becomes the legal guardian of R.J. Heatwole, who is Susanna's good bit younger brother. And when R.J. becomes 17 years old, well, now he is in danger of being drafted into the army. They have now lowered the age of conscription to 17. He's had his 17th birthday, and it's decided that he will go through the mountains on the Underground Railroad. Well, this time Henry, I guess Susanna was doing much better now, Henry decides to go with him. So they do go through the mountains together with 15, it's a total of 15 17-year-old boys, plus Henry Brunk was older, he was a deserter, whereas these younger boys are merely draft dodgers. Brunk is a deserter, and a man named David Frank is with them, who's also a deserter. And initially, they have a guide that takes them through the mountains. Their destination is New Creek Station. And I just threw this slide in so you get a feel for what West Virginia looks like in that area. This is not a great slide in terms of, it doesn't look like March because it's more of a December kind of shot, but this is what that mountainous area of West Virginia that they're going through looks like. So this group leaves Weaver's Church. This is Peggy's church, Weaver's Mennonite Church in Harrisonburg, or west of Harrisonburg. They leave at night. Matter of fact, we know they leave at midnight, and we know it's early May. They stop at Raleigh Springs and spend the day there, because they only travel at night at this point. And that's where they meet up with guys that are going to take them the next step. And the next step is across the Shenandoah Mountain at night, which is a little tricky at night, especially if you're not on a trail. And they come down the other side, and the guides turn around and go back to the valley. They say, okay, you're fine now. You're in Pendleton County. West Virginia is now West Virginia. It has seceded from Virginia. You're safe. The swamp dragons, the local home guard, they're in control. You should be fine. They weren't. But Brunk knows that he has done plastering work for a widow. He calls her a rich widow that lived just beyond the Shenandoah Mountain. So he feels like if they can get to the widow's house, that they'll get some assistance, maybe some food, and And they do eventually get to the widow's house, and she tells them, I will help you, but I want to make sure that my slaves, she actually had some slaves, don't find out what you're up to, because they'll leave with me. And I don't know for sure if they promised that they wouldn't tell slaves, but they got fed. So they agreed in some way to, okay, we won't say what we're doing. And lo and behold, the slaves likely followed them anyway. So in the next part of the story, the slaves are actually with them. There are three black men with the group, and they run into two soldiers, same story, near Petersburg, demanding their swords and their guns, and they show them their pocket testaments. And I think Brunk was probably thinking, I've been down this road literally before. And this time, these soldiers, in fact, are swamp dragons. They are Unionist loyal soldiers, and they actually help them to move along and make progress toward getting to New Creek Station. And then they are confronted again as they approach New Creek Station. They're confronted again by two soldiers, or two or more soldiers. And they said, you know, if we hadn't seen these three black guys with you, we would have just started shooting, and some people would have been shot. So the story goes that the black guys actually saved this group from physical harm. And they make it to New Creek Station. And I recently found this slide at the Library of Congress, and this gives you a pretty good idea of what they would have seen as they're coming down out of the mountains, and they see New Creek Station. They can get on a train there. It's usually controlled by Union troops, sometimes Confederate troops, but they're lucky. It's now controlled by Union troops, and they can get on a train. The train runs kind of diagonally across the middle there, train tracks. And they can go, they initially go west, take the oath of allegiance, and then go back in toward Maryland and Pennsylvania. So now we're going to switch a little bit and talk about Susanna, the third part of the story. When Henry Brunk goes through the mountains, he tells Susanna, I will get word back to you, just like Charles Rogers got word back to Magdalena that it would be safe now to come to Hagerstown, Maryland. I'll do the same thing for you. When I get there, I'll let you know. You'll get a letter through the underground. And we know that Peggy was actually, in addition to all this other stuff she was doing, she was the postmaster for that area of the Underground Railroad. So these letters are coming through Peggy, but no letter arrives from Brunk. Susanna becomes anxious, and she just decides one day that I'm going to go. I'm going to go to Hagerstown and see if I can't find Henry. So she hitches up a one-horse wagon, a one-horse spring wagon, and she would have had Sarah with her, who's about, I think, not quite 2 years old. Little John Albert is gone, he has died, and she takes off. And she picks a terrible time to do this. There will be, you'll see in some history books that it says that Magdalena and Susanna went at the same time together, and that's really not true. There was about a year between them. So they were both alone when they made this journey. And it's 120 miles maybe. And she arrives at the Potomac River. She's got the Confederate Army on her tail. She's got the Union Army ahead of her. She's between the two armies. And lo and behold, as the Union Army is retreating, they set the bridge on fire at Harper's Ferry. So the bridge she needs to cross the Potomac River is on fire. And she is able to cross the river anyway. There is a local person there who is able to tell her there are other ways to cross this river, and he shows her where she can ford the river. It would be difficult to ford the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry in a one-horse wagon, but she did. And she made it to Hagerstown, and almost miraculously, Henry in a cobbler shop. She sees him through the window and says, okay, there's Henry. And they're reunited. But they're not happy there very long because the Confederate Army, remember, was on her heels. They're moving into Maryland and Pennsylvania at this point, being more aggressive, and they're coming very close to where Henry and RJ and Susanna are living. And they're afraid that they're going to be conscripted into the Confederate Army, even though they're in Maryland. So they decide to go to Illinois. Illinois, there was a man, a neighbor, Abraham Funk, who had taught Henry Brunk some of the stone carving trade. And Henry was able to get a promise from Abraham Funk that he would have all the work he wanted plastering houses in Illinois for $3 a day. So he thought that was a pretty good deal, and it probably was. So they went to Illinois, and that's where all of the remaining Henry and Susanna Brunk children are born. They're born in Illinois. So anybody here descended from Etta? Henrietta? Yep. Joe? Yep. George? Who am I missing? Minnie? Who did I miss? The others died, right?
I think, yeah.
Okay. So once they're in Illinois, they get a little antsy because there is no Mennonite church there, and they really wanted to have a Mennonite church that their children could go to, and they decided that they're going to move. They're safe, they're prosperous, everything is fine, but they want to move. And they look at Missouri as a possibility. You could argue that maybe they would have been better off if they'd gone to Missouri. And their local friend is telling them, come on down to Missouri, everything's wonderful here. And then they're waiting to hear about the Kansas colony. Now, they've already read about this in the Herald of Truth, the publication that the Mennonites were just starting to publish at the time. And there are all these rosy stories about how wonderful things are in Kansas, and you should come down here. And so RJ does kind of a scouting trip to Kansas. The source on this, by the way, is a letter from Henry Brunk to Gabriel Heatwole. Gabriel Heatwole is the guy that was back at Castle Thunder that was supposed to be the first one to be executed. So they've maintained a close friendship. Also, I should mention, in this letter, he says, I want to see about putting a tombstone on little John Albert's grave. Because now we're about the 10-year anniversary of his death, and there's still no tombstone here. So this letter covers a lot of ground, but we see this interest in Kansas, or possibly Missouri. And of course, RJ comes down and says, you need to come down here, it's wonderful. I'm going to stay, and I've bought 2 pieces of property, and this would be where the Brunk Cemetery is now, out between Hillsborough and Marion Center. If you go north from that cemetery, that would be the Brunk, 160 acres, and if you go beyond that to the north, that would be the R.J. Heatwole, 160 acres. So he buys these 2 farms, and he says, come on down, and they do. They come down in a covered wagon. And this image is not them, but it is a family making a covered wagon trip into Kansas in 1869. So it's pretty close to what that might have looked like. Now, the lady in this picture, it looks like she may have had a child, and they're all looking at the baby. Susanna does not have a child on the wagon train, on the wagon down, but she is pregnant. So if you can imagine how difficult that journey was, compounded by the fact that she's pregnant. But they make it. And of course, Henry does not last long beyond that. Henry crawls into the crude little shelter that either he made or maybe R.J. Heatwole made for him, and dies within 8 days. So there's now Susanna's on the prairie without Henry and with all these children. And in fact, Two of the children died fairly soon after that. She gives birth to Henry Jr., and then in the spring, Henry Jr. dies as well. So this is going to be the sequel to Peggy's War. I'm working on this right now, researching what happens to Susanna after she gets to Kansas. And I think it would have been pretty tough. The grasshoppers show up the following year. Does everyone here know about the grasshopper plague? I think it's one of the most interesting chapters in American history that no one talks about. But the grasshoppers, I would think, discouraged a lot of people. And I think that might be the reason why Susanna may have told Magdalena and Charles, don't come right now. Because suddenly the narrative was, come to Kansas, and now it's don't come to Kansas. Things are really, really tough here, and plus we have these grasshoppers. And I think that's why the Rogers family waited very wisely before they came to Kansas. And there were other hardships as well. The grasshoppers ate almost everything, but they didn't seem to have much of a taste for sorghum. And so people here started to plant more sorghum. And RJ, being very enterprising, RJ Heatwole, buys a sorghum processing facility, plant, for lack of a better word, machine, horsepower machine. And he asks Susanna, can Joe come and feed the sorghum stalks into this processor? And Susanna says, okay, and this is going to be done at night. He wants to run round the clock with the sorghum processing. Now, apparently he's being very successful at this. And of course, Joe, his hand goes into the machine and eventually has to be amputated. So now Susanna has these children, and the oldest of the children, Joe, is not as able as he was. Although he was at this point in time, I'm pretty sure he was 11. Later on, there's another story about Joe Brunk being in charge of the children, and by then I think he was 15. But at this point in time, it's pretty certain that this happened in 1876. And we have a financial record of what Susanna was spending money on behalf of the children as administrator of her husband's estate. And the medical bills for Joe occur in mostly 1876 and a little bit in 1877. They were very fortunate in that a surgeon had just moved to Marion Center. So Dr. Hanford did the amputation and the follow-up, and he was fine, other than the loss of the hand, of course. Now, this is not Susanna, but on the left is Mathias Cooprider, who moves in to the area in 1876. Yeah, 1876. This is his first wife, and the little boy on his lap is John Albert Cooprider. And again, how many here come from John Albert? Quite a few, yeah. All right, so that's John Albert there on Matthias's lap. But that's Matthias's first wife. He comes to Kansas. By that time, she has died, and second wife is too sickly to make the journey. So she comes down about a year later on the train and then dies about a month after she arrives. And then we have this wonderful quote from Dr. Helen Cooprider Friesen. How do you say it?
Friesen.
Who we just found this about a week ago. And in Stella Erb's booklet, she had a piece of paper that said what Stella's book doesn't say about Henry Brunk. And she had this great quote in there where she says, in parentheses, she says, quietly now, Grandpa C, that's Grandpa Cooprider, married Grandma B, Grandma Brunk, 47 days after Tom's mother died. Tom was the other, you had John Albert, you had Tom, and who am I missing? Walter. Are the three boys, but Tom's mother was the second wife. And she dies, and I think probably more out of necessity than anything. They get married within 47 days. But I think it's interesting that Florence has to say quietly now, like she's just going to whisper this to us, and here we are in a big auditorium. So it was a hasty marriage, and of course there was a little bit of a rocky marriage, and then I think most of you know from that point on the stepchildren, the step brothers and sisters, two of Peggy's, I do that a lot, Susanna's children, two of her daughters, married two of Mathias Cooprider's sons. So that, as I think John has said on several occasions, really confused the genealogists, but made for how do you say it? One of the most interesting stories or crazy stories we've ever heard.
The most interesting, yes.
So that's going to be my next book. It won't be called Invisible Brunk. I think Susanna. It'll be something Susanna, because the emphasis will be more on her, because it starts with her and it ends with her. And Henry unfortunately dies during the book. So I'd be happy to take some questions if you have questions about this. There are people in the audience that knows parts of the story a lot better than I do. So don't be shy about asking questions or volunteering information. John, I know you've got a question. I explained everything?
Almost everything. Was John Cooprider, I always had in the back of my mind that he had been a Confederate soldier. Is that correct? Or
Yes. Mathias. This is a big switch for Susanna, because their lives had revolved around keeping Henry out of the war. And now she's marrying Mathias Cooprider, who is a Union veteran of the war. So this would have also probably meant that R.J. Heatwole, her brother, probably did not approve initially of this marriage. Later on, Mathias becomes a Mennonite, and he becomes a Mennonite minister, and the Kansas-Nebraska Conference allows him to keep his pension. There was a lot of discussion about that. Can you be a Mennonite minister and have a military pension? But in this case, they did allow it. But that's a great question.
And another son of Henry and Susanna is George, who becomes a famous evangelist, right?
Yes. George R. Brunk, and there were three of them, but the first one, George R. Brunk, was their youngest surviving son. I have that right? Youngest survivor was George R.
Yes, because she thought he would die, so she put it under
Yes.
tree, and he survived.
Yes. When they arrive on the prairie, they're all sick, including Susanna. And the children are dying. Henry dies. They think George R. is going to die too. And he refuses to take his medicine. And the medicine is probably doing more harm than good. This might be why he lived. But he refuses to take the medicine, and finally Susanna says, just leave him alone and let him die. And he doesn't. I don't know what they were giving him for medicine, but it couldn't have been very good.
So the evangelist was George II.
The more famous evangelist, the more prolific evangelist was George But George R. Brunk first actually did hold evangelistic meetings, and this was controversial at the time in the Mennonite church. You really weren't supposed to have, what would they call it, consecutive meetings on consecutive nights. They were opposed to that. So what they would do is they would announce one meeting at a time. They would never say, we're going to have 3 meetings. We're going to have a meeting tonight, and then at the meeting said, well, let's have a meeting again tomorrow night. We seem to have interest here. But yes, George R. Brunk was a very well-known Mennonite leader, actually. Controversial, but very well-known. And then, of course, Dr. Say the word.
Friesen.
Friesen becomes a missionary. She would have been a grandchild, but becomes a missionary and a doctor in Africa?
India.
India. I told you you know more about this. Any other questions?
So how do Mathias and Susanna get together? How do they know each other?
John and I were talking about this today. It's interesting to me that Mathias' second wife, married Nancy Mace Cooprider, Tom Cooprider's mother, comes down on the train. She's sickly. She comes down on the train, and she dies within a month. And she is buried in the Brunk cemetery, or at least there's a tombstone for her in the Brunk family cemetery. So you would think that the Coopriders lived very, very close to the Brunks, and yet, as far as I know, there's no evidence that he took out any kind of claim or purchased any land from the railroad at that point. So I don't know if he was working for the farmer adjacent to the Brunks, or how that all, maybe renting a farm, I don't know. But he was there with his boys. His wife dies, and within 47 days, he marries Susanna. And a lot of people in this room wouldn't be here if he hadn't. So that's a mystery. That's one of the many things I'm researching for the second book. I wanted an answer to that. Any other questions I should be researching?
Are there any other Mennonite ministers on monuments in courthouse yards for Civil War service?
Are there any other Mennonite ministers? Yes.
On monuments in courthouse, county courthouse yards?
Is Mathias one of a kind?
Oh,
Mathias is on the courthouse wall, or
Oh, he is?
in McPherson County.
oh, I did not know that. I think he's probably one of a kind for a Mennonite minister. This is some sort of plaque or
Monument, yeah.
A monument with Civil War veterans in the courthouse yard in McPherson.
In McPherson. I always hesitate to say all Mennonites did this or all brethren did that. There were Mennonites who served in the Confederate and Union armies that were excommunicated from the church, and some were allowed back in. But I don't know of any that are on any kind of memorial to Confederates. I think he's probably one of a kind. I didn't know that.
You mentioned troubled marriage between Mathias and Susanna. Why did you say that?
Well, the main reason is I'm echoing what I've heard other people write at this point. So I can't point to any primary sources that back that up. The question was, why was Susanna and why did Mathias and Susanna have a rocky marriage? There were a few things that have been pointed out, and I think probably exaggerated over the years, but certainly didn't help. When Mathias decided to move the family to McPherson, he left the Brunk children to take care of the farm, the old farm, out here by Hillsborough, and while they went and planted and built a house in McPherson. And this occurred when Joe Brunk, the son that had lost a hand, when Joe Brunk was about almost 15 years old. And in George R. Brunk's account of this, he says that he's 11 or 12. And that's not true. He was 15. He was almost 15. Etta was about 13. So they were left alone with the younger children to fend for themselves for at least a couple of months while Mathias and Susanna and Mathias's older children, older boys, got the farm going in McPherson, and then they came back and took the whole family in 1880, goes to McPherson. I think that's probably one thing that bothered her a lot. The other one probably was that they, at some point, George R. Brunk was farmed out to farm on his own probably, and was not physically located with the family anymore. And I think that made a big impression on Susanna because she was farmed out as a child. So I think that probably was maybe amplified a little bit in her mind, and probably in George Brunk's mind as well. Because he was, I think, 16, 17 years old, was farming on his own. So there were some things that Susanna would not agree with. And there was also about 2 years of time before Mathias becomes a Mennonite. And we do know that Susanna was very, very insistent that all of her children, she wanted them all to be Mennonites, and she wanted them all to go to her church, and she wanted them to go together. That's why they moved from Illinois to somewhere else, because there wasn't a Mennonite church in Illinois. And we know that during that 2 years, Mathias generally took his family to United Brethren or maybe Methodist churches, and that probably didn't sit very well with Susanna. It was probably better than not taking it at all, but in her mind, they should have been going to the Mennonite church. So I think there was some friction there. Anything else?
I just wondered, I suppose I could look it up online, but I'm just wondering how you got interested in this project and when you started. And it's just, I want to say thank you because my Uncle Eugene, a lot of these are my cousins, and the previous generation, Uncle Eugene's my dad's youngest brother who was asking questions there. They would be very grateful to you.
There is a story about how I got started on this.
Okay.
And it is the introduction to my book. I'll give you the short version. When I was 4, my older brothers came to get me and they said, Carl, we have found the cave where, we found the cave where our great-great-grandfather hid the guns during the Civil War. There was this family legend that our great-grandfather had hidden guns in a cave during the Civil War. We weren't quite sure how or why. And we looked, I tried to go and see the cave, and they wanted me to squeeze through a little opening because I was little. And I chickened out, and I wouldn't do it. But I continued to look for that cave, and as I started researching this story, mostly just genealogical research, I came across this testimony that said, if you're caught with a gun, you can be shot as a bushwhacker. And then it starts to make sense that they had a reason to hide guns. And so then I found out later that the Exemption Act also required you to turn over all your guns to the Virginia militia to be used in the war. And I think that gave them a second reason to hide these guns. So we kept looking for the cave, and last summer we found it. And it's right where the legend said it was going to be. We just didn't understand as children where and how to go about finding it. So we did find a cave. There were no guns in the cave, but I grew up with that family legend, and that plus the genealogical research kind of came together, and I said, this is a book. This will be a good book. And now I think the Brunk, Henry Brunk and Susanna is maybe even better book.
You know that there is a Kansas history of George Custer, and you mentioned that in the past, also in Virginia. I did not realize that connection.
Yeah, George Armstrong Custer was not a nice person. During the burning of the Shenandoah Valley, notoriously, he ordered the execution of a retarded man for carrying a gun. I think that's probably what you're referring to. And this was done as an example to people, like if you're going to carry guns and take pot shots at my soldiers, I'm going to start executing people who are carrying guns and not wearing uniforms. So when someone goes into the Underground Railroad, if they're a deserter and they have a gun, they need to get rid of it. So that's even yet another reason why you have to get rid of the guns, or at least store them somewhere, get them out of sight. But yeah, Custer, the quote from the Shenandoah Valley was, someone said to him, you're going to lie in a bloody grave for this. And he did. Anything else? I think that's it.
No, appreciate it.
I should mention that my wife knows how to sell books. I just know how to talk about books. She's always willing to sell books.
Does anyone know here what kind of a creature Mathias turned out to be?
My grandmother, okay. My grandmother told me that he wrote his sermons on the buckboard on the way to church. And then she looked away and said, and you can sure tell.
Any other comments, anything you want to add to the story? Well, tomorrow we'll be doing some more exploring. We'll see some more Kansas dust. We'll go to West Liberty to the Cooprider farms. And anybody's welcome to go along, although my car won't fit anymore. But Eugene and a few relatives will be going.
Leaving
So follow along.
when?